Hello, my name is Jessica de Suza, and today I shall be discussing the German notion of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which means coping with the past. This is my favourite word in Germany in 5 words because it sums up something which we all must do, especially Germans, given their country's national, tumultuous history during the World Wars. Germany is one praised for collectively confronting its Nazi past, but the subject has remained a taboo in millions of family homes, with children and grandchildren declining to press their elders on what they did in a war. In order to rectify this, German historian Moritz Pfeiffer asks his granddad and his grandma what they did in World War II, and then fact-checks their testimonies. His findings in a new book shed light on a dying generation that remains outwardly unrepentant, but is increasingly willing to break decades of silence on how and why it followed Hitler. Although this may be awkward dining room conversation, it remains very important. It remains very important given the fact that this generation is dying and that soon it may become too late to find out answers. I'd like you to imagine something. Imagine this lady who may or may not look like your grandmother, this sweet, loving, nurturing character. Now imagine associating her with Hitler and his regime. This is something which Pfeiffer often struggles with, as he describes his grandmother Edith as a committed, almost fanatical Nazi. However, this project was simply not an attempt to just pass judgment or castigate his grandparents. However, he wanted to understand them, and to understand their role, and what led these people to follow such a regime. His grandfather, Hans Hermann, was so good at goose-stepping that he was briefly transferred to a parade unit in Berlin. His grandmother, Edith, then joined the Nazi Party and was so zealous that when she married Hans Hermann, she provided documentation tracing her Aryan roots all the way back to the early 18th century. However, during the course of his research, Pfeiffer found large gaps, contradictions, and evasive answers in Hermann's testimony regarding his purported ignorance of mass executions and the Holocaust, for example. He thought to himself, this just doesn't seem to add up. Few would disagree that Germany as a nation has worked hard to atone for its past, unlike Austria and Japan, which have cloaked themselves in denial. However, although it may not have cloaked itself in denial such as these nations, there still exists large amounts of individual denial and an unresponsiveness when it comes to the atrocities of the war. For example, in the interview, Hans Hermann was frank about his attitude towards Jews in the mid-1930s, when he was in his early teens and a member of an affiliated Hitler Youth. When asked about this, he says, "No, we didn't regard that as an injustice. We had to go with the times, and the times were like that. The media didn't have the importance that they do today." During the investigation and the interrogation, it seems that Hans Hermann had the same attitude of evasiveness and ignorance. However, the facts did not seem to add up. For example, when asked about the invasion of Poland and the execution of civilians, Hans Hermann was evasive, at first describing relations between the German army and the Poles as friendly, and saying he knew nothing about the mass shootings of Polish civilians at that time. When pressed by Moritz, he admitted he knew about killings committed by the SS, but added that the Wehrmacht had nothing to do with it, a typical attitude that reflected the long-held myth that regular German soldiers were not involved in these atrocities. However, perhaps more chilling are the words of his grandmother. "I am still totally spellbound by the words of the Führer that were stirring and inspiring as ever. I glow with enthusiasm. One feels strong enough to tear out trees." This quote goes to show that it's not simply a battle of truth and lies, but a battle of empathy, humanity, and compassion. As Pfeiffer says, why did the humanity of my grandparents not rebel against the mass murders? And why did my grandfather, even in his interview in 2005, concede guilt or shame or express any sympathy for the victims? As usual in worldwide atrocities, there was a severe lack of empathy. There was collective guilt, but not individual guilt. However, Although there were very few verbal admissions of guilt from his grandfather, throughout his life, Hans Hermann showed a lot of non-verbal admissions of guilt. For example, after the war, he encouraged his daughter to learn French and even hosted French pupils on exchange programs. He also supported the European integration policies of Charles de Gaulle and avoided going to veterans' reunions. This plants seeds of hope. And perhaps my favourite quote of all is that in 2005 he was outraged at first by research done by Pfeiffer about the Wehrmacht in war crimes. However, a few weeks later, he told his grandson, "I have thought a lot about it, and there's some truth to it." If an old member of the Hitler Youth and an old member of the Nazi Party can admit to these atrocities, then there is hope for Germany, and there is hope that these atrocities won't be committed again. If only the young generation take it upon themselves to ask the right questions and to get the right lessons from this. Thank you very much for listening.